When war came to the United States in 1917, most Americans never dreamed that the country would be sending a large expeditionary force to France. Instead, the assumption was that America would contribute to the war effort through its Navy, as well as providing materials for its allies to continue fighting on the Western Front. However, by the spring of 1917, Europeans were running out of money and manpower to fight the Germans. To make matters more complicated, Russia had withdrawn from the war. The Bolsheviks had seized power by 1917 and considered World War I to be a capitalistic war over boundaries and property. This released many Germans from the Eastern Front, and they, the battle-tested warriors, flooded the Western Front in France. Wilson disliked the idea of a conscription, but eventually accepted that it would be a necessary and temporary measure. This draft immediately faced opposition from Republicans and anti-imperialists in Congress. But after a month of debate, Congress authorized its use, and the Army grew from over 500,000 men to 4 million. For the first time in American history, women were also admitted into the armed forces. While the Army would continue to refuse women's right to enlist, nearly 11,000 women enlisted in the Navy, 269 of them to the Marine Corps. Wars often bring opportunities and innovations, as well as the danger of destruction. As U.S. Army nurses went into harm's way at the fighting front in France, the century-long struggle for women's suffrage intensified on the home front, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920. African Americans also served in World War I, though were often resignated to labor units and always strictly segregated. Military authorities hesitated to train blacks for combat. But the need for more men on the front lines led to exceptions. One unfortunate exception was that while most recruits were expected to receive 6 months of training, most of them were sent over to the front lines within weeks. This image is of an African American combat veteran from the 369th Colored Infantry Regiment, also known as Hellfighters, or the Hellfighters of Harlem. Segregation followed black servicemen even into death. When Congress appropriated money in 1930 to send Gold Star mothers to visit graves of slain soldiers' sons in France, it provided for separate ships, hotels, and trains for African American women. Several black mothers, preferring to remain at home and retain our honor and self-respect, reluctantly refused to make the trip to visit their fallen sons' graves. In this image, we can see women serving on the front lines in the trenches as battlefield nurses. Another reminder that war often brings opportunities and innovations out of necessity. "30,000 Americans initiated the country's involvement in the World War I's battlefields at the Chateau Thierry, right in the teeth of a German advance. This massive German drive took place in the spring of 1918. Allies to this point had been unified under one military leadership, that of French Marshal Foch. Germans smashed to within 40 miles of Paris in May of 1918. They threatened to knock France out of the war. America's contributions put decisive weight on the scales to blunt the German drive and prevent the capital of France from falling. Americans joined in a second battle, the Second Battle of the Marne, in July, marking the beginning of Germany's withdrawal from France. Here we can see the battlefield lines and how close they came to toppling the capital, Paris, of the country France. America quickly demanded that it receive its own front and independent control over its own forces. With no other choice, France and England agreed. General John Blackjack Pershing was assigned to the front lines as America's military commander of its expeditionary forces. He received control of an 85-mile front that stretched from the Swiss border to the French front line. In the late summer of 1918, Pershing's army would undertake the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This would be America's largest battle in all of history. I highly encourage you to watch the separate YouTube video that details the heroic efforts of the United States and its allies at the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This would engage 1.2 million American troops, sacrificing 120,000 Americans in casualties. By the fall of 1918, Berlin was looking for a treaty that would bring about the end of the war. Wilson and his 14 points once again stepped into the breach as the international leader who would bridge together the demands of these long feuding sides. But before Wilson was willing to negotiate a peace treaty, he demanded that Kaiser Wilhelm be removed. The exhausted Germans laid down their arms at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. This day became known as Armistice Day, and today we celebrate Veterans Day as is part of its anniversary. Kaiser Wilhelm fled to Holland and lived there for 23 years, unwept, unhonored, and also unhung. The cost of World War I was near incomprehensible. 9 million soldiers died from combat. 20 million other casualties were sustained in the fight. On top of that, 30 million people died of the influenza pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu. These nearly 60 million casualties that stretched over the course of World War I constituted about 2% of the whole world's population. The United States was essential to victory in World War I, but it wasn't because of its battlefield contributions or even its production of war material. Instead, the United States would act as the Allies' grocer, both offering foodstuffs, munition credits, oil, as well as the possibility of new manpower that could have sustained the war beyond Germany's capacity. The prospect of endless war with the United States troops reserves, rather than America's actual military performance, eventually demoralized the Germans. Pershing's army, in fact, purchased more supplies from its European allies than we ever shipped from the United States. Most of its artillery and virtually all of its aircraft were purchased from Britain and France. Again, the United States was not the arsenal of democracy it would be in World War II. Perhaps one of the most notorious and devastating parts of the battlefield injuries that soldiers sustained were those from the chemical warfare that was conducted in the trenches. This image is a portrait painted by John Singer Sargent, known as Gassed. Here he's captured the horror of trench warfare. The use of chlorine and mustard gases would scar, burn, and blind soldiers that survived it at all. We must be careful not to overstate the influence of the United States in the military successes and contributions to World War I. Here we can see that American casualties in this epic battle were only a sliver of the grand total. Perhaps our greatest contribution would be President Wilson's involvement in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles itself. Now, before we begin this, it's important to note that Wilson would go through a series of political and personal issues that would greatly diminish him as a leader and his capacity to effect change in the United States and abroad. As the leader who would bring together the Entente and the Central Powers, he was heralded as a political celebrity all across the globe. The popularity and the promises of his 14-point speech left the world hopeful for a better and brighter day. Perhaps too hopeful, Wilson would fall short of delivering on his promises. His celebrity was also a topic of scorn by his political rivals. Republicans, led by imperialist Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, were very frustrated that no Republican would participate in Wilson's campaign overseas. President Wilson would work with 3 other international leaders to shape the terms of the new peace. Premier Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Premier Georges Clemenceau of France have become known as the Big Four. Wilson met with these leaders and told them that he wanted to prevent vengeful parceling of colonies and protectorates of vanquished powers. He would back off of his more ambitious call to eliminate colonial territories abroad, especially for those that had been victorious. The most consequential land adjustment coming out of World War I would actually take place before the war was over in the first place. The Allied powers had secretly agreed to divide up the Ottoman Empire once victory had been accomplished. In this case, France was to receive Syria, and Iraq would be controlled by England. These oil-rich territories would be entrusted to these countries by the League of Nations and identified as protectorates. Premier Clemenceau would also push Wilson to give in to French demands to control Germany's coal-rich area of the Saar Valley and Italy's demand for the Fiume, a valuable seaport in Yugoslavia. France eventually settled on a compromise. They were willing to allow the Saar Valley to be under the control of the League of Nations for 15 years. And then the League would use popular vote to determine whether the Saar would go back to Germany or return to France. Wilson didn't have any more success with the Fiume. While he wanted to see Yugoslavia keep control of its own region, ultimately his appeal fell flat. With the terms pre-negotiated by the Big Four, a peace delegation met at the Palace of Versailles in France in June of 1919 to hand its decisions over to the Germans. Germany had sent delegates of its own, but they were denied the opportunity to speak or negotiate on their country's behalf. Total submission would be the only acceptable approach to negotiations as far as the Allies were concerned. Vengeance, and not reconciliation, was the treaty's dominant tone. Germany had hoped peace would be based upon the 14 points, and when it was discovered that nothing but abject surrender would be expected, loud and bitter cries of betrayal burst from the Germans. These would be charges and accusations that Adolf Hitler would later use to establish himself as a popular leader of a new Reich. But it wasn't just Germany that showered the Treaty of Versailles with abuse. Back in America, those that hated the Germans argued that this pact was not harsh enough. For liberals and anti-imperialists, they felt it was too harsh and a gross betrayal of Wilson's original 14 points. German Americans, Irish Americans, and just about every hyphenated American was aroused because the peace settlement was not sufficiently favorable to native people of lands that had been colonized. For example, the Irish even feared that the League would empower England to crush any move for Irish independence. While a strong majority of Americans did favor ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, the loudest and most famous voice in opposition to it was Henry Cabot Lodge, Wilson's personal and political nemesis. In July of 1919, Lodge began a holy crusade to defeat the Treaty of Versailles. While he had no real hope of defeating it, what he really was aiming to do was to amend it, to Americanize it, to republicanize it and senatorialize it. To divide the public opinion, Lodge read the entire 264-page treaty aloud in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and held protracted hearings to air grievances about the document. Chief amongst his concerns was that of being a member of this new League of Nations. He questioned whether membership in the League of Nations would break with the Monroe Doctrine and eliminate America's ability to protect its interests in the Western Hemisphere. Furthermore, he entertained the ideas of isolationists. Would this be a break with the isolationist tradition that stretched back to George Washington of avoiding entanglement with foreign nations? Here's a political cartoon that really does demonstrate the influence and objections of Henry Cabot Lodge. We can see Uncle Sam is being married off to foreign entanglements. This would have been a derisive term for the League of Nations. If the United States were wed to foreign entanglements in the League of Nations, would it have to give up its own independence, its own sovereignty? Bursting through the window, we have Henry Cabot Lodge holding on to a document that says constitutional rights and clearly objecting to what he would have felt was an unconstitutional union or a sacrifice of America's sovereignty. Henry Cabot Lodge alone cannot be responsible for the United States' failure to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson himself must bear a substantial share of the responsibility. Because the president demanded that Congress ratify the treaty as is, or not at all, he ended up getting nothing at all. Rather than negotiating with his critics, Wilson himself began a holy crusade to defend the treaty. He went on a whirlwind national tour of America's cities where he championed the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. If the tour wasn't the undoing of the treaty, it was certainly the undoing of Wilson himself. In September of 1919, the president suffered a nervous and physical breakdown. His tour was ended prematurely, and he was whisked back to Washington, D.C., where several days later he had a stroke that resulted in the paralysis of part of his body. For the next few months, his wife Edith would shelter him from the public as the president recovered physically and cognitively from his impairments. Edith Wilson acted as the president's courier, and some historians believe that many of the decisions that were made during the president's time of recovery were actually made by Edith herself. Some historians have gone so far as to say that Edith Wilson was America's first female president. Wilson would never fully recover his strength. He would retire at the end of his term and attempt to make the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles the single issue of the election of 1920. He would tell the American people that the election of 1920 was a solemn referendum on the Treaty of Versailles. The assumption was that if the Democratic candidate, James Cox, were to win, it would be clear to the nation and the world that the treaty must be ratified unamended. Ultimately, the election of 1920 ended with the election of Warren G. Harding, a Republican Party man. That settled the debate. America would be the sole member of the Allied powers to not ratify the treaty, aiming to end the war of all wars. And it wouldn't participate in Wilson's greatest accomplishment towards a lasting peace, the League of Nations.